Edinburgh is a tourist town, right? And like actually in recent years, I've found that Edinburgh's tourist economy, apart from like at the Fringe or at New Year's or something, it's thrived on two major factors. One has been ghost tours that you might have seen if you're walking around the Royal Mile, and the other is just Harry Potter shit, basically. And the only thing that's more bullshit than all the ghost stories that they tell tourists here is that they tell them that every cafe they're in is where J.K. Rowling wrote Harry Potter. If you're in a cafe in Edinburgh, it's more likely that J.K. Rowling wrote her latest transphobic tweet there than any of them books. But there are some ghost stories that are based on true events that you hear about in Edinburgh, right? Like, see, when I was young, my mum and my auntie went to go and see Tina Turner perform live in concert at Murrayfield Stadium here in Edinburgh, right? And so they got a wee cheap hotel to stay overnight, and they went to the concert and came back, and they were still singing and dancing and having a whale of a time. But little did they know that the place they were staying in, story goes, was haunted by a ghost known as the White Lady of Corstorphine, who's meant to haunt the grounds of this hotel. It was only the next day they realised, because they went for breakfast, and one of the staff came up to them and says, "Oh, so last night, did you see the White Lady?" And my mum was like, "No, we seen Tina Turner." We didn't even know anyone else was playing, to be honest. And Tina Turner died last year, which is sad, wasn't it? Like, it's just a thing that happens, right? See, whenever a celebrity dies, there's always another celebrity that's described as leading the tributes to the person that's passed away. But tributes are never actually led by anyone. Like, basically what happens is people will post, like, condolences online, and then the news will pick a name to describe as leading the tributes based on who's most likely to get the most attention. Like, for example, if some rocker for the 70s dies, Mick Jagger will put out a tweet saying, "Rest in peace." Next thing there's a story saying, "Mick Jagger leads the tributes to this cunt." Now, I think it's right, Mick Jagger doesn't know he's going to be leading the tributes, you know, when he's writing that. He's probably embarrassed, looking at him like, fuck, I only met that guy twice and I thought he was a bit of an arsehole, to be honest. I'm leading the tributes to him, you know, like, and I think, like, different people are described as leading the tributes to the same person, depending on the different news sources that you look at. Like, when the Queen died, like, BBC News went with Prince Charles leads the tributes to Queen Elizabeth. It made sense, you know, he's her son, he's the heir to the throne, he's the new king, you know, and I'm sure William will be described as leading the tributes to Charles when he shortly dies as well. The Daily Express went with Liz Truss leads the tributes, which did make sense because for that brief mental moment in history, she was the British Prime Minister. Although, to be fair, that's probably one of the last times she's ever described as leading anything, you know, other than possibly one of the leading suspects in what caused the Queen's death in the first place. But if you, like me, get a lot of your news from the social media feeds of Glasgow Live, you would have been under the impression that the tributes to Queen Elizabeth II were led by none other than Lorraine Kelly. I like to think that's the story that the royal scene. Lorraine Kelly leads the tributes to Queen Elizabeth. They're like, fuck it, we're really losing the public's back in here. Is that the best we can do? Elton John must be still raging about Diana or something. Anyway. To truth be told, I'm actually for a place just outside Glasgow called Clydebank, right? And one of Clydebank's claim to fame is it was bombed by the Germans in World War II. Yet if you walk the streets of Clydebank today, you'd be forgiven for thinking the Second World War took place sometime in the last fortnight. There's a big shipyard in town, a lot of it closed in the 80s. Thatcher finished off the job that Hitler started, basically. I'm still living at home, right, and I'm from Clydebank, so I'm still living there. Although a lot of my mates from school, like when they moved out of their parents' place, they just moved to somewhere else in Clydebank, which I never used to understand, because like, surely you'd want to get as far away for this shithole as possible. But then recently I've been looking at property prices, and I'm like, do you know what, Clydebank's got a lot going for it, actually. A certain charm I had never noticed before. Because I live at home still, basically that's why I can do stand-up full-time, right? And actually in the last year or two, me and my mates started this podcast as well, and that started to go all right enough. We're making a wee bit of money for it, and if it can continue to grow, then it's probably the most likely way I'll ever get to start making like a stable enough income that I could afford to move out. The only problem is we record that podcast in a shed in my back garden, so if I ever move out, I don't have a podcast. If I don't have a podcast, I'm not moving out. It's a catch-22 scenario. And I'm too old to be living at home. Became quite stark that I was too old to be living at home recently, right? Because, first of all, my wee sister, who's 6 years younger than me, she moved out. She moved in with her partner, right? And then we got new next-door neighbours. And the guy who bought the house next to my parents was a guy who was in my year at school. And it was him and his wife moved in with a 3-year-old kid. And the worst part of this is when I realised that, see their kid, I am the kid next door. It's going to be a bad day when he chaps the door, asks if I'm coming out to play. It's going to be even worse when he moves out before me, though. I think that'll be the final straw. I'm looking at my neighbour, right, and he's bought a house and he's married with kids, right? I'm still living with my parents. I'm single, like. Seeing you're single and you live with your parents, basically your options in terms of looking for a partner are just limited to somebody who doesn't live with their parents. I'm on the apps chatting to somebody, I'm like, "Are we up to tonight?" And they're like, "Oh, just having dinner with my family." I'm like, "All right, and is that an every night thing, or is it a kind of once in a occasion catch-up type of deal, The last lassie I was seeing, right, she actually had her own place, right, and but she had an upstairs neighbour that was always giving them a lot of grief, which I learned the first time we went back to our place, because after a few minutes, right, of just being in the bed, enjoying each other's company, right, all we hear from upstairs is this. So I was like, fuck. So I just shouted up and I was like, "The harder you bang, the harder I'll bang." And then before she could respond, the lassie I was with was like, "Bang harder!" So I'm still single and but I'm living at home. My dad's a difficult guy to live with, right? Don't get me wrong, see my dad, he has a fountain of knowledge, but that fountain is full of pish. It's been harder to talk to my dad in recent years because he's been going deaf and he's in denial about the fact he's losing his hearing. Like, he's been prescribed hearing aids, he just refuses to wear them. So, like, whenever I have a conversation with him now, I need to constantly repeat myself and he'll see me getting aggravated. He's like, "Mark, why are you getting annoyed? You're mumbling. And see not wearing your hearing aids and accusing somebody else of mumbling. I'd be like not wearing your glasses and accusing someone else of being blurry." It's like, "You're not blurry, son. You need to straighten yourself up." I should probably say at this point, by the way, that I did buy these glasses before the Jeffrey Dahmer Netflix series came out. It was not the intended look I was going for, but here we are. The only concession my dad makes to going deaf is that whenever he watches the telly now, he always has to have the subtitles on. In fact, the only time he turns off the subtitles is if he's watching the football, because they take up too much of the screen and you can't see the play. But what that means is that whenever I watch football with my dad now, he will just repeat almost exactly what the commentator has said right after they've said it. So, like, it will zoom in on a player and the commentator's like, "And of course, today he's playing against his former club." My dad's like, "Do you know he used to play for them?" I was like, "I think I heard that somewhere." Recently, actually, aye. But he does that all the time in conversation as well, where he'll unknowingly sort of repeat something that we've just been saying in front of him, to the point where it's actually quite uncanny. Like, I've actually developed a theory that I think what's happening is my dad just hears something being said so faintly that it goes into his brain and he mistakes it for his own thoughts. He's just like, "I'll just say that, aye." I'm looking at him like, "I've just been talking about it for the last 5 minutes." He's like, "How am I meant to know you're mumbling?" But you always have arguments with your parents when you live with them, right? Like, see the amount of times, like, I've been going to iron a shirt or something, right? I'll put the ironing board up, put the iron on. My mum comes into the kitchen, she's like, "Mark, do you want me to do that for you?" I'm like, "No, it's fine, I can do it." She's like, "Mark, it's no bother, just give me it here." I was like, "Right, it would save me a bit of time, actually." And she's like, "A mother's work is never done." It's unfair, right? You can't just offer to do a thing with someone and then moan when that offer is accepted. Like, you wouldn't volunteer to give blood, then about to stick the needle in your arm. You're just like, "Well, I suppose it's always up to me to look after everybody else, is it? So just take, we lot." But I'm lucky that I've got sport enough parents that I can stay at home for a bit longer, right? And I've realised as I've got older that I've had good parents growing up. Like, you can tell you've had good parents growing up if the worst thing that ever happened to you when you were young is that you would ask for a present for a birthday or a Christmas and your parents would get you, but they'd just get it slightly wrong. I remember first time this happened to me, I was about 6 years old and I'd asked to get my first football top and I wanted my name on it. So my mum buys me this top and gets my name printed on the front. of the top, like where the sponsor would normally go. It just said Marc in big bold letters. Looked like a fake, right? And this was the mid-90s, right? It was a Celtic top. And at that point, Celtic were going through a lot of financial difficulties, right? But never get that bad that it had been plausible that a 6-year-old boy had managed to sponsor the fucking team. As far as I know, C.R. Smith was just another wee guy for Glasgow with a bit of extra cash lying about. And you know, my parents don't even remember this happening when I asked them about it, right? Which is annoying because I had so many questions. Because, like, to me, there should be so many points where that could have been prevented, right? First of all, my dad clearly knew better, but obviously what's happening, my mum's taking it home, showed him, and he just looked at it and went, this isn't worth an argument. You know, I'm not buying a new one, and plus, who cares? He's 6, he's not going to remember this 26 years later and bring it up in front of a room full of strangers because of the trauma that ensued, right? But even when my mum went into the shop, I can only imagine what's happened, right? Because the guy must have said something, right? I can only imagine what's happened. And she went in and said to the guy, oh, listen, my son, he wants his name in the top. It's Marc Bercy. He spells out all the letters, and he goes to turn around the top. And my mum's like, what are you doing? He's like, I'm just putting the name in the back. She's like, no, I'm sure he said he wants it on the front. He's like, no, I'm pretty sure no one has ever said that. The names, they go in the back of the top end. She's like, I told you, I want my son's name on the front of that top. He's like, do you want to like chip your man or something? She's like, oh, just give me a mother's work is never done. So, my mum actually died a wee while ago, and it was quite sudden and unexpected. And she had cancer, and she'd actually only been diagnosed like 3 months before, and it was a relatively positive prognosis. But she got some treatment, and she took a bad turn over the course of just a few days. By the end of the week, she had to get rushed to hospital, and they took her up to A&E, and then after a few hours, they told us that she wasn't going to make it. Now, I'm going to talk about this a wee bit, and I know it's a difficult subject for a lot of people to hear and to even know how to respond to, particularly in this kind of environment. But just know that if you don't laugh, you will make me feel worse. So, but, you know, we woke up that day not expecting that to happen at all, right? And by the end of it, we're up in A&E, and they're telling us, basically, like, once they switch off the machines, that'll be her away. And they just, at that point, then asked us, does she need the last rites? Now, we're not really religious, right? We grew up Catholic, but we didn't really bother with it, except from my gran, who's my mum's mum, who was there, and who, before anyone else could respond, was like, oh, yeah, she needs a priest, right? So we're like, for fuck's sake. This already been the longest, most arduous night of our lives. It's like 3 in the morning on a Wednesday, but hard to get a fucking drug dealer at this point, right? Never mind a priest. Suddenly we need to wait another 2 hours for this fucking hoodoo man to show up, right? And so we're all sitting in A&E by the bedside, just, you know, hoping it's not prolonging my mum's agony, right? And basically, the priest eventually comes in, and he was a wee kind of like Indian-looking sort of Asian guy, right? And even though this is one of the worst points of my life, I couldn't help but raise a smile at the fact that I could see my gran's religious fervour clashing directly with her old-fashioned racism. I used to see her scrunching up her face like, what parish is he from? No wonder he took so bloody long to get here. I was like, that's what you get for putting us through this, you daft old racist. And no harm to this guy, right, but he evidently was not first name in the team sheet, right? Because, look, I've seen some bad stand-up in my time, right, but this is one of the worst performances I have ever witnessed, right, like, because, like, I guess English, you know, like, I guess it wasn't really his first language, so he was kind of stumbling over his words, he wasn't projecting. My dad's like, he's mumbling. I'm like, no, he is mumbling, actually. This is one of the only times he's been right about that. So he kind of stumbles through the last rites, and the thing is, like, I guess the last rites is meant to, their functions as kind of a way to comfort a grieving family at that time, right? But by the end, I felt like I was trying to comfort him. I'm like, oh, that was brilliant, mate. That was honestly one of the best Hail Marys I've ever heard. Started saying to him all the stuff that people say to stand-ups and have had a bad gig. Fair play to me. I don't know how you get up there and do it, honestly. Must take some boys. So he finishes up and goes away, and we say our goodbyes, and they switch off the machines, and my mum was away. And now, there's quite a common thing in recent years for comedy shows where the comedian will talk about heavier topics like grief and death, and particularly death of a parent, right? You see that a lot here in Edinburgh during the festival, right? And there's actually so common as a name for it. It's called a dead parent show, right? And to give you an idea of how common it is and how prevalent it is in comedy generally, right? Last year, the American comedian Marc Maron put out a HBO special where he was talking about the death of his partner, which means that I'm not even the only Mark who spells his name with a C, who's recently done a comedy show talking about death. I've not even seen his show, but knowing my luck, he's probably got a bit about how she bought him an American football top with his name on the front of it as well. A lot of these shows, right, they'll kind of wallow in grief and self-pity and sometimes manipulate the audience emotions and stuff like that, right? But it's not really what I'm interested in. It's not the type of person I am. And it certainly would have been the sort of thing my mum would have hated, right? Like, because my mum would always say stuff like, oh, it's not what happens to you in life that matters. It's how you react to it. She's always trying to keep a positive mental attitude, to the point where she didn't even like listening to like sad music. Like, sometimes my dad would have some depressing song on in the house, up really loud, obviously, and my mum would hate it. She always like, get that shite off. To be fair, he would say the same thing to her when she's listening to Simply the Best by Tina Turner, but for different reasons, right? And so I've tried to keep positive as much as I can, and I've tried to be grateful for the time I had with my mum, right? Like, my mum was like really young, like she was 57, right, which is no age at all, right? But I was 30 by that point, and I think when you get your 30s, like dealing with death of parents and stuff like that, you're just going to need to handle it. It's a part of life, and it's a lot longer than a lot of people get as well. Like, the day before my mum's 21st birthday, she came home from work. She'd been given loads of presents by her workmates and stuff, and she learned that her dad had been found dead in the street. He died of a heart attack. He was a joiner and like a heavy smoker, and I think because I've had that story in my family for so long, I've always had an aversion to smoking or manual labour. And but to this day, my gran still says, I would have never got through your Grandpa Frank passing if it wasn't for your mum. She looked after me when I couldn't look after myself. And my mum, like, it was certainly like that for everybody else in her life. To be honest, like, she would help people out so much. She was actually quite annoying, right? Because her house phone was more like a fucking Samaritan's helpline. I just answer the phone and just be some woman crying. Ah! I'm like, Mum, it's for you. Like, just give her a second, and she's just finishing ironing my shirt right now. Actually, later in life, she found her passion, right? My mum, she took a wee course in aromatherapy and started giving people massages and stuff, which, when I was a younger, more inexperienced comic, I made a lot of cheap jokes about, as you can probably imagine, right? But that's fine. You can leave now, that's fine. Believe it or not, I'm used to people leaving me before they're meant to. I'll probably just need wait for her to go. She needs a wait. That's fine, man. No, I get it. I can see that you've had about 5 drinks already, so I might just wait for her to come back. How long does she usually take when she goes for a drink? You would carry on? All right. I'm not asking any more questions for now. Okay, fine. Right, what was I saying? Right, sorry. Then she'd done a lot of work in the local community and stuff like that, and then she ended up like building up a client base over 10 years, getting a place of her own where she could take clients. And most of their clients were kind of elderly or middle-aged women, and a lot of them, you would see them come in and they'd look as though they had the weight of the world on their shoulders, but they'd always go out with a spring in their step. And I think a lot of my mum's clients got just as much out of the massages as they got out of just talking to my mum and getting that kind of positive energy and stuff from her. I remember my mum told me about one of her clients she was giving advice to, and it was actually the mum of somebody I went to school with, right? She shouldn't have told me this, but what are they going to fucking do now? And but I remember thinking how lucky I was that I had such a good mum that she could act like a mum for other people's mums, you know? So when you lose somebody like that, it's obviously there's a big void there, right? And, you know, you can't help but, you know, think about different things and why did it need to be somebody like that you lose, and what if it'd been some other way. And like, I would never say that if I could have changed it, like I'd have wished like, for it to be my dad or something like that. Like, I would never say that, right? But I do now wish that he would die as well. You know, I've lost most of the love and parental support. I might as well get the fucking house. Like, honestly, right, I love my dad, right, and I hate to admit it, but see, if my dad dies, most of my problems are solved. Like, my wee sister keeps saying, we need to get dad therapy. I'm like, just leave him, he's fine, just let him deal with it in his own way. You know, just let him bottle it up. That's never resulted in anything negative ever, a guy doing that. You gonna walk down the bridge, Dad? That's cool, just take your time, fine, just, you know, take it easy. No, I don't think that all the time. I'm worried about my dad seeing that joke when we put this out, but I'll just make sure that when he watches it, there's no subtitles. That's how expensive it is to buy a house these days, right? That basically, if you're of our generation, right, and you've got parents that own property that die under suspicious circumstances, you are the prime suspect. You know, the police try to develop a motive. They're like, who could possibly have anything to gain from these two boomers suddenly dying? I don't know, maybe the person that's going to inherit their 3-bedroom semi-detached in Clydebank, for example. No, we were worried about my dad, right? But to be honest, like, I was really proud of how he dealt with the whole thing, because straight away he didn't crumble and he just started getting on top of stuff and doing all the horrible bits of admin you need to do when somebody passes, making the phone calls and the arrangements and whatever. I think I knew he was going to be all right quite early on, because I heard him say something that was just so him that I realised he was still there. Basically, when you organise a funeral, you need to order a death certificate. And I heard my dad on the phone ordering the death certificate, saying to them, "No, a second-class stamp will be fine." I'm like, are you fucking kidding me on? A second-class stamp? Like, are you potentially going to delay this funeral to save, 12 pence? He's like, no, a second-class stamp comes just as quickly. I was like, that's not really the point, is it? The point is more, if not now, when would you ever find it appropriate to buy a first-class stamp? Like, what circumstances would need to arise? Who would need to die before you want to splash out? I tell you, my mum would have been fucking raging if she knew. I swear to God. I swear to God. There was 10 days between my mum passing and the funeral, because turns out second-class stamps don't come as quickly. And I think in England, like, it's common for there to be a longer gap between someone passing and the funeral, but 10 days was quite long in Scotland, right? And I think that bit between somebody passing away and the funeral, like, to me, it felt a lot like a kind of fucked up version of that bit between Christmas and New Year, because like, you don't go into work and you lose track of the days and you get visits from family members you can't be fucked talking to. I think the door would go and I'd be like, oh, for God's sake, it's no bad enough my mom's dead now. I need to talk to Auntie Tricia. Jesus Christ. The point my mum passed, basically the COVID restrictions meant that we could have people at the funeral, but we had to limit it to 50 people. If we'd known at the time, we'd have just held it in Downing Street. We could have invited as many people as we fucking wanted, right? But we had the service in our local chapel, right? And if you've ever been to a Catholic church before, you'll know that when you go in, there's holy water at the door, and you might dip your hand in it and do the sign of the cross, right? But because of COVID, this has really been exposed as a massively clatty super spreader style action, right? So they cordoned off the holy water and they just had hand sanitizer when you came in the door, which weirdly some people were pressing and then still doing the sign of the cross. Turns out all along the Holy Spirit was ethanol. I'd done the eulogy, right? Like, I just thought it's the least I could do because my dad had done so much for the funeral, right? And, you know, I do this for a living, so I talk, right? And I've seen mates of mine for school and that give eulogies, and I'm always really impressed how composed they are and how, you know, like, sometimes they'll get a lot of laughs in that as well, right? Like, I said, then sort of felt a bit of pressure, right? Because I was like, oh, I kind of need to get some laughs. I do comedy, but I don't want to look as though I'm trying to get the laughs, you know what I mean? You don't want to look as though you're trying to shoehorn in material and all that. Like, but they're going, I remember the last words that my mum ever said to me, Mark, your dad is a fountain of knowledge, but that fountain is full of pish. The hard part of a eulogy is, like, basically you try to figure out how to honour someone's memory. And that's actually the hard part just after somebody dies in general, is you try and figure out how best to do that. And, like, even after my mum passed, basically, me and my sister were trying to debate about whether or not to put it on social media, right? Because we were just like, you know, we didn't want to make it look as though we were trying to make it all about us or look for sympathy, but this is just how people find out about things, and we realise, like, it's probably better to put something out now before Lorraine Kelly gets wind and is described as leading the tributes instead, you know. And honestly, see the messages that people sent after we put that post up, like, they really helped. And the one thing I would say is if you ever know somebody who loses a person or whatever, is send them a message. Because sometimes you're worried about sending the wrong message, but the only wrong message to send them is no message at all. Except from the woman who used to work with my mum, who sent a nice message followed by a frankly inappropriate emoji. I do know that my mum is dead. You don't need to also include the wee coffin symbol afterwards. Most of the messages people send are along similar lines, and that's the thing, right? Because sometimes people won't even remember what you've sent them, but they will remember that you've sent something, right? And most of the messages I got after my mum passed were something along the lines of like, "Oh, if there's anything I can do to help, just let me know," which was nice because some of them were for lassies I've been trying to shag for years. I was like, well, there's a few things that might help the grieving process actually. Just one question: do you still have your parents? Actually, do you know what? It doesn't matter. It's just me and my dad now and he can't hear a thing. You can come back to mine. My dad's been dealing with it in his own ways. Like, I think the one thing I see is that he sometimes looks back at his and my mum's relationship with rose-tinted glasses, which is quite understandable, right? But me and my sister pick up on it a lot. Like, the other week he was watching some, 80s throwback music programme, and one song came on, my dad's like, "Oh, your mum loved that, your mum loved that." And I'm like, I distinctly remember her telling you to turn that shite off. He's been going to the cemetery a lot as well, my dad, right? And he told us that he brings my mum flowers every 2 weeks. And I just looked at him and I was like, you do know that if you'd done that when mum was alive, you would have got on a lot better? And he was like, I know. And then my wee sister goes like, "Oh, you never buy me flowers?" And he went, "You don't need them." And she's like, "Would you buy me flowers if I died?" He's like, "Aye, of course." I think for guys of my dad's generation, it's kind of easier to deal with expressing your emotions for somebody when they're no longer here. Basically, I think that's the conclusion I've come to. But what I ended up doing with the eulogy is kind of what I've ended up doing with this show, right? Which is I just try to talk a wee bit about who my mum was and what was important to her, what she meant to the people closest to her, and to try and make sense of what had happened. And the only thing I could take away from it all was, seeing my mum passed, I just seen how much better she'd made the lives of the people that she'd interacted with. And it made me realise that we're no longer here. All we really leave behind is the impact that we have on others. And if we just try and make that as positive as we can, then I think that's the best measure of success in life. So I've been trying to keep that in mind as I've been going about my life. And even with comedy, I've had thoughts in the past, maybe this is a trivial thing to be doing. Should I even be doing this in my life? And now I just think if I can give people a laugh for a bit, maybe that's enough, And maybe that's a weird thing to be saying after I've just been talking about death for the last 20 minutes. But, hopefully in years to come now, I'll have much more positive things to talk about on stage, like if my dad dies, for example. Hopefully sees at my next show, Marc Jennings, homeowner! Coming to a town near you. No, but that's, to be honest, keeping that kind of thing in mind is actually what led to me and my mate starting that podcast as well, right? Now, you might be thinking, the last thing the world needs is another fucking podcast with 3 guys talking all that shit, right? And you'd be right about that. But we record the podcast in the shed in my garden where my mum used to take our aromatherapy clients. And from time to time, we get messages from people saying stuff like, "Oh, listening to your podcast really helped me through a hard time in my life." And whenever I read those messages, I just think to myself, "Oh, we're carrying on the spirit of what my mum done in the same place that she done it." And it took me a wee while to get around to moving any of her stuff out of that. And I eventually did, right? I was going through some of her things and I found this wee note, right? And I don't know when my mum wrote this or even really why, but at the top of it, it just says notes to self. And under it just had 3 things. It said, keep positive, keep happy, and live life to the full. And I was so grateful that I found that, because now, if I'm ever thinking of how best to honour my mum's memory, I just keep those 3 things in mind. And I thought there's no better way to end a show than just to share that with you as well. Although if my mum knew I was ending my show by using something that she'd wrote, she'd probably be like, a mother's work is never done. Thanks very much. Cheers.
I feel strong.